Welcome to week 14-15. Dr. JC here. We're going to talk a little bit about this age of discovery. Embedded in that age of discovery are some concepts such as mercantilism, European colonialism, and the reasons for this age of discovery or exploration. And then in the second part of this lecture, we're going to take a look at British colonial America specifically and talk about some founding regions within British colonial America as a way to kind of do a little American history at the same time. So we're going to take this in two parts. In the first part, we'll focus on this age of discovery or age of exploration. They are synonymous. Now, when we're talking about this age of sail or age of discovery or age of exploration, they are all synonymous. We're talking really about the 1500s to about the mid 1800s in Europe. And there are several reasons why Europeans are going to look to do exploration. The first has to do with the impact of the Islamic world. We talked about the navies of the Ottoman world beginning to raid into European waters. Another reason as it relates to the Islamic world is, if we're going to trade overland, everything coming from the Far East, all those riches, the silks, the spices, you name it, from the Far East or Orient, they are traveling overland through where? The Islamic world. Therefore, the Islamic world is being enriched at the expense of the Christian world. So as a way perhaps to do an end run is to do what? Sail south around the Horn of Africa, or apply an Old English proverb which says too far east is west. And if we're going to too far east or trying to get to the Far East, maybe we should sail west. The aforementioned are just a few reasons that motivate Europeans to begin to sail abroad. But the key point to remember here is that they do begin to explore the entire globe. With respect to the globe, Europeans are going to learn a little bit more about the size of it, if perhaps less a way to measure the circumference of it. Once Ferdinand Magellan and Juan Sebastian Elcano begin this first circumnavigation of the globe, they'll be on the Victoria, and while Magellan will be killed in the Philippines, Juan Sebastian Elcano will finish the voyage and complete the circumnavigation of the globe. This will be the first time this is done. Whatever the purpose of a voyage, and not all of them obviously are going to be to try to circumnavigate the globe. At the end of the day, they're just trying to find a shortcut to the Far East. Every one of these voyages, however, is going to have with them cartographers. You got to map what you're seeing. While a number of maps are going to be created, arguably the most important, perhaps to Americans, is this Waldseemüller map. In 1507, Martin Waldseemüller and Matthias Klingman are going to be the first to specifically use the word America on a map. Now, they're doing it to honor Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine explorer, but it is the first that uses the word America on the map. This is new. This is not India. This is not the Far East. This is America. This is a new world. And so important was this that the Library of Congress, the U.S. Congress, spent $10 million for it, purchased it in 2001, and we can view at least a facsimile of it today in the Treasures Gallery of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. It's really cool. If you get a chance, you should check it out. So as all of these Europeans begin this exploration, and yes, it starts with Columbus and that stupid thing I had to remember when I was in grade school. It went something like this. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Stupid, right? Well, I guess maybe not too stupid. I remember it. And there is some merit to this, that yes, Columbus starts this, but Columbus had to receive a commission from somebody, and that somebody came from kings and queens. So the big question then becomes, what do kings and queens looking to get out of this? To harken back at the end of the previous lecture, when we're talking about that Reformation period, we also talked about it being this age of absolutism, meaning absolute authority in kings and queens, absolute authority in monarchs. So if there's absolute political power, should there not also be absolute economic power? And if so, that absolute economic power is best served held where? At the state level. And perhaps the best example of that is in France. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the Minister of Finance for the French under Louis XIV for several years, helped establish this mercantilist system. Well, I'm not going to go into details here about the nuances associated with mercantilism. That's best handled in an economics class. I will say this briefly about it. Mercantilists like Jean-Baptiste Colbert believed that the best way to grow a nation's economy was through government regulation, through the pursuit of a favorable balance of trade, and perhaps even the hoarding of monetary reserves, gold and silver. Thus, as a way to sort of reflect the political centralization, the economy should do the same. Yet one of the salient shortcomings of protectionism is that it actually impedes the willingness of other nations to want to trade with you. So if you tax the goods coming into your country from someplace else, they're likely to tax the goods that you're creating shipping abroad. And it can lead to trade wars, which in turn would lead to actual outright military hostility or wars. So while this will be the dominant theory from roughly the 1500s to parts of the 1700s, it will be replaced by Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations, this idea of laissez-faire, a free hand, free trade, and in fact it will be promoted within France by a group known as the physiocrats as well. Save that for another day and another lecture. You'd say, well, if this is a failing system, well, how did it last so long? Well, part of the reason for that is because it was based on this notion of attaining a favorable balance of trade through finer finished goods. And as long as you had colonial possessions, that was going to be a constant for you. Example, and we'll see this when we talk about British colonial America. Britain will establish colonies in North America. They will extract raw materials and resources from that colony, ship it back to the parent nation, which is Britain or England. They will create finer finished goods and ship them back to the colonies for purchase. So it was a system that worked really well if you were focused on enriching the state. And if you were Louis XIV, that worked just fine, because then Louis XV and others could go ahead and continue the work on Versailles and create real cool places for themselves to live and enjoy. Didn't work out so well for the rest of the French people, which is why they eventually called BS on that and started to say, look, if we are going to create and innovate, we are going to enjoy some of the fruits of that creation and innovation and labor, most of which we'll see explode in this thing called the French Revolution, which is more towards the second half of this course. All right, enough of that economic theory. All that theory aside, how does this play out in the opening of this new world during this age of exploration? What's this whole business about a triangular trade all about? Well, most of us know that this triangular trade is the movement of goods and peoples throughout what we would call the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world is more recognizable as an expression today, replacing triangular trade, replacing Columbian exchange, because it focuses on the key four continents in this Atlantic world, which is Europe, Africa, South America, and North America. So if you hear about the Atlantic world trade today, just think of triangular trade or the Columbian exchange. In the final section of this lecture here, and before we move on to part 2, which will be on British colonial America, I want to take a minute here to talk about the movement of peoples into the New World. In the New World, we're talking specifically about North and South America here, and what historian Gary Nash would call the collision of red, white, and black in the Americas. So I want to take a minute to talk about that, because it's very important. And we'll come back to this transatlantic slave trade in a minute, but I want to talk first about European landings in the New World. They're going to bump into First Nations or First Peoples. Might be referred to as Indians, Native Americans, Redskins, call them what you want. But understand, just because they all had reasonably the same colored skin didn't mean they got along with one another. Therefore, the difference between race and ethnicity matters, and it matters a lot. Just because you were a Redskin didn't mean you liked all other Redskins. We'll see examples of that once we get into British colonial America next. The difference between being Narragansett and Pequot. The difference between being Catawba and Cherokee. Chickasaw and Choctaw. No different than the difference between what? English and Frenchmen. I'm pretty sure they butchered one another wholesale. And the same will apply in the black African world as well. Just because you're all from West Central Africa doesn't mean you get along. We already talked about this. There were several thousand different peoples, over 10,000 different others prior to European contact. That means there's 9,999 other people that you don't necessarily get along with. Thus, one of the first things we need to consider when we're looking back at this time period is to jettison all 21st century baggage, especially in the modern age, because it seems like we read race into everything today. Well, what I want you to do when you read back into history here is read ethnicity, not race. So starting in the Americas in contact with First Nations. Most of us know this story, and it's a catastrophic story. It just is. And it has to do with the fact that First Nations, First Peoples here in the Americas, did not have the immunities built up to European diseases like smallpox, and it would utterly devastate whole societies. As shown on this slide here in the bottom right hand corner, you can see the devastation wrought by disease within a couple generations. I mean, we're talking northwards of 20 plus million people all the way down underneath 2 million. And as a result of this, it's going to have an impact on the way Native peoples look at white-skinned folks and vice versa. Again, we'll talk about this in the next lecture. But understand, when you outnumber somebody hundreds to one, you don't see them as a threat when they first get here. Native peoples didn't see white folks as a threat when they first got here. But when you start dying off by the bushelfold at the same time those white people keep coming like stars in the sky, now they can become a threat. And that's when you can put aside your different ethnic differences and band together as a race to oppose another quote-unquote race. Again, we'll talk about that in the next lecture in British colonial America. Another important element of this high fatality rate amongst native peoples is labor. Europeans need laborers. And in the next lecture, British colonial America will take this up, whether they should employ red-skinned folks, white-skinned folks, or, as we'll see, and here's a spoiler alert, black-skinned folks. And the high fatality rate amongst redskins is going to lead Europeans to start to look to the continent of Africa and the use of black labor. The transatlantic slave trade that's going to bring about 12 million souls forcibly from the old world, from Africa to the new world, is what we remember today as the African diaspora. Anytime you see the word diaspora, I want you to think of a forced migration. This is when people are forced to move. Therefore, the transatlantic slave trade can be remembered as, and should be remembered as, an African diaspora. One of the components of this African diaspora was this wretched experience for those that had to go through it, known as the Middle Passage. This is where souls are crammed into ships' holds, and if they happen to live to get to the other side of the Atlantic, then they have to undergo the humiliation of the slave block. But there was a percentage dead loss that was going to always occur, and if you are a businessman and morals and morality don't matter, money does, and if you know there's going to be 10% dead loss, why only carry 20 slaves across the Atlantic when you have fixed costs if you can carry 200? That's just the brutal reality of the game. It was a very lucrative game, and if people can make money doing it, by damn, they probably will. Before closing out this lecture and pivoting in the next lecture to British colonial America specifically, I wanted to take up one other key consideration as it relates to the slave trade itself, and that has to do with control. Who controlled it? And while this may be an uncomfortable topic for some folks, especially in the present age, modern scholarship, to include that coming out of the region itself, does suggest that the slave trade was largely controlled by local peoples themselves. There's a reason why Europeans couldn't enter the center of the African continent until the end of the 19th century, because they weren't strong enough. So yes, while there is a racial aspect to this, understand ethnicity mattered. Folks in Africa, as elsewhere in the world, had been selling one another wholesale for a long period of time, selling them across the Sahara into the Islamic world. And if you've got long-standing enemies, you capture them in warfare and you want to sell them, maybe it's better to sell them all the way across the Atlantic, because good luck, even if they escape there, what's the likelihood they can come back and exact some revenge upon you or your family? So do know that early on in the slave trade, African peoples themselves controlled the trade largely. They did. And because they did, it reveals an underpinning humanity, an underpinning equality in both virtue and, in this case, vice, that they too had the ability to go ahead and make money off of someone else. And that's the larger important story here, that these aren't helpless Sambos, black people, as had been professed for a long period of time. No, they're actually very intelligent, strong people from great civilizations that are human. So as we turn next to British colonial America and start talking about labor, I want you to keep this in mind.